Welcome to the Common Good Podcast, a conversation about the significance of place, eliminating economic isolation, and the structure of belonging. My name is Rabbi Miriam Turlinchamp, and I'm your host. For this week's episode, as a part of the ABCD book talk on January 19th, John McKnight and Cormac discussed their new book, The Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth, and Power of Neighborhoods. ABCD, or the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, is at the center of a large and growing movement that considers local assets as the primary building blocks of sustainable community development. Building on the skills of local residents, the power of local associations, and the supportive functions of local institutions, asset-based community development draws upon existing community strength to build stronger, more sustainable communities for the future. In this episode, John begins by describing the 6 basic building blocks of community before handing it over to Cormac to explore the 7 functions of a connected community. Here's John.
The book is called The Connected Community. Another way of looking at it, though, is that it's a book about neighborhoods, but neighborhoods thought in a little different way. Neighborhoods that are thought of as magical places, the many mysterious places, places of great adventure. But most of us don't think about neighborhoods that way. So I think this book is sort of a guide to opening our eyes to what's there. And I know that for years I never had open eyes as to what was in the neighborhood where I was. I learned how little I saw in the place I was in Ireland, where Cormac comes from. In Ireland, my wife and I went to a little town in the west, had 20 houses, I think, 1 store, 1 church, and farms around it. Outside of the town was a lake, and I love to fish, always carry a rod and reel with me. I decided it'd be wonderful to fish, and I went to the local store because I didn't have any bait. And I walked up a little path into the store, and the store was pretty small. Old Irish gentleman was there, and I said to him, "Sir, I'd love to fish in that lake." I said, "Do you have any bait?" And that stopped him for some reason. He said to me, "What do you mean bait?" And I said, "Worms." And he looked at me and he said, "Sonny, you walked in my path and there are 3 big stones on either side of the path. And if you just go out there and turn the stone over, you'll find what you're looking for. They all have worms under them." And I felt so foolish because instead of looking at the place where I was for what I needed, I thought I had to buy what I needed. And so that opened my eyes to the fact that the neighborhood is the same kind of a place. It's a place that has so much to offer. I had another experience that led to this book. I started out as a neighborhood organizer, but I went to a university in the latter part of my career. And my chief colleague there was a man named Jody Kretzman. I know that some of you know him, and it's with deep sorrow that I have to say that my chief colleague over the years passed on, and we had his funeral on Saturday. But he was a wonderful guide. He had been a neighborhood organizer. I had been a neighborhood organizer, and we both went to the university at the same time to a new research institute about cities and their neighborhoods. What we found was 24 scholars who were doing research about neighborhoods. However, what really struck us both was that all of this research, which they then gave to or sold to social service agencies or government, all of those started with the premise that this place called a neighborhood was filled with problems, with needs, with deficits. And Jody and I thought, but we've been there. And yeah, they got problems like anybody has in neighborhoods that have problems, but they didn't do any research on what it was that people who were there had done with what they had there to make life better. And so we decided that was the piece of research we did. We went to about 20 cities in North America in neighborhoods and talked with people. We asked them this question: can you tell us what the people have done together here that has made things better? And we collected those stories and found that within the stories, there were things that they used when they made things better rather than turning to a university to figure out how they should be fixed. So we published a book called Building Communities from the Inside Out. And it's a guide, our first guide to what's in a neighborhood. And the book we're talking with you about is really what we've learned in the subsequent 30 years about neighborhoods. What we found was we looked at every story that we collected in the neighborhoods, said, what did they use? We assumed there was something there. It wasn't just a bunch of problems that other people, outsiders, saw. And we concluded, after looking at over 2,000 stories that we collected, there were 6 basic assets, we call them, or you could call them ingredients. I like building blocks the best. We said assets because we were in the university. We had to pick some words people wouldn't understand. But I think if we'd pick words people would understand, we would have said, well, these are building blocks. And so let me begin us on this journey by going over with you the particular kinds of assets that we found that people used when they made something better, when they were the producers of their lives and their future. There are first, the gifts and the skills of the local residents. Second, the associations, clubs, groups, and organizations that people created, in a sense, to magnify and connect their own gifts. The third thing that appeared in the stories was very local institutions: firehouse, hardware store, YMCA, local institutions. You all know there are 3 kinds. One is public, one is not-for-profit, and one is for-profit. The fourth thing we found is that there was a great deal of exchange that was of great value that was going on inside the neighborhood: sharing, trading, connected, buying, selling. The fifth thing is the place itself, we found, was often a valuable building block that people used. And the last one we found was stories, that people use stories about the neighborhood and what it had done as a way of, number one, understanding what they had done. It was like a library of learnings about how we made this a better neighborhood. And those stories also, I think, become the basis for culture. Every culture has its stories which carry the learnings through time, right? And so those are the basic assets, we would call them, with people used when they made things better. Let me say a few words about those 6 basic building blocks that might make them even more visible. The first is that everybody in a neighborhood has abilities, gifts, and skills. And we found that there are 4 questions that if you ask them of anybody in a neighborhood, you will make a major discovery. And the 4 questions are: can you tell us what are your most significant gifts? And by that, I mean what you're born with. What are your natural talents? The second question is, what are the things you have learned, not that you were born with, that you have learned, that are most significant in your mind? The third one is, what are your passions? And your passions are so important because passions are interests that become action. Next question is, what do you know that you know well enough that you could share it with other people on the block, and especially share it with the local children? So that's the first asset. And you got a treasure chest in your block, I can assure you, or in your building if you live in an apartment. Those four questions, plus others, of course, can open up an understanding of the possibilities for building things, because you'll find that people just have so many gifts that you can hardly believe it. In fact, we've run into a situation a lot of times where people find out what capacities people have on a block, and there's so many, they say it's so hard to see where we're going to start because it's so rich here. It was here all the time, but we just didn't happen to see it. The second asset is that people in the neighborhood get together into groups, into organizations, into clubs, into gatherings. We call those associations. And why they do that? Well, they do it, number one, because sitting there with a capacity, gift, or passion and not sharing it is frustrating. And so associations get built because people have capacities, gifts, and interests that they want to enjoy more for themselves and to share with other people. So associations are the way people bring their natural capacities together, and together that becomes a set of building blocks for shaping their future. And there are all kinds of associations people belong to in all kinds of neighborhoods. And we've got lots of examples of those associations. The third asset or building block is the local institutions. And those institutions might be a fire station, hardware store, YMCA, but they're local. They're within the capacities and control of local people. And what we have learned, and I think want to make especially clear here, is the difference between associations and institutions. We would say there are paid groups of people in institutions, and there are groups of people together, and they are like a circle. One's circular, the other's hierarchical. Each has its place. Just very briefly, hierarchies, almost all institutions are built as hierarchies, and they are like a hammer. They are not like a saw, or they're not like an association. They are distinctive institutions, and they're built for a few people to control many people. Their purpose is to produce goods and services. They create clients and consumers, and they need needs for survival. But associations are different. They give you all kinds of choices rather than the decisions of somebody above you. They create care. They don't have money to produce goods, but they are the main sources of care in a neighborhood. And the name of the people who do this in the associational world is not clients, it is citizens. And finally, they need capacities, not needs. They need people who are producers, not consumers. So, very important, do you know the difference between an association and an institution? And why? Because they each have unique capacities. And if you don't know the capacities of associations, nothing in an institution can do the job. You can never hire enough police to be safe. But we know that associations and associational life on a block or a neighborhood, scientifically, over and over, it comes out. The associations and the relationships people build from them lead to much more security than the police can ever provide. Fourth asset is exchange. That is, people are trading, sharing, giving, and buying and selling. And that exchange is an asset if you can keep it happening within the neighborhood. And the sixth is stories. And I already mentioned the significance of stories. They are the library of what we've done, and you can find there the building blocks of how we have done it. So those are the six basic assets.
Before Cormac discusses the 7 functions of a connected community, we invite you to take a breath and, like John said, consider your own neighborhood as a place of mystery, magic, and adventure. Here's a poem by Ada Limon. It's called Dead Stars. Out here, there's a blowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us. Black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash. The rolling containers a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerta, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly, we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust, and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of street light with you, towards what's larger within us, toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no? No to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, of the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth? If we declared a clean night? If we stopped being terrified? If we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big, people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out, after all of this is over? Now, Cormac discusses the 7 functions of a connected community.
So it's 2023, really big year for folks passionate about community. So it's the 30th anniversary of the Green Book, and it's the 50th anniversary of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, published in 1973. So a big year, lots to be hopeful for, despite what the media are telling us. There is still cause for hope, and we're it. It's on us. That's both exciting and overwhelming somewhat. So I thought I'd start. The idea was tonight that we'd talk about 2 features in the book. So one is the idea of the assets. And about 30 years ago, that was really emphasized. This idea, it was an important story to remind people that we have something worthwhile. We are worthwhile. We are not just the sum of our needs. We're also needed, and we have what we need to be useful. That's an important message, I think, and that's held ground over 30 years. In this new book, what we're emphasizing is that while it's really important to know what you have, you must also know why you want to use what you have in order to create a regenerative, a thriving community. And that's really critical, because what that says is you've got to have a why as well as a what. You've got to have a vision that is directing you collectively as a community towards where you want to go. From there, make sense of why we would go and look for our resources, our building blocks, or our assets. So that kind of simple idea of you say to somebody, so what do you care about enough to take action on? And if 3 of your neighbors helped you, what would you love to do around here? I think that's a much better starting point than tell us what assets you have in the neighborhood. We count up all the things we have, and then everybody looks at everybody else and goes, now what? So we have to have a sense of purpose, a sense of motivation. Another way of thinking about that, which I think is what we're trying to work through in the book, is what is our purpose? Or another word for that would be, what is our function that together we can take on this canvas called the neighborhood? And what is it that is unique about this work? It's work that we won't necessarily do as a family in isolation from other families in the neighborhood, or do in institutions like our workplace, or even do among circles of friends. So thinking about that question of what are our neighborhoods for, in the sense of our associations in relationship with all of these different features that John has been talking about. And our working answer to that is that there are 7 unique and essential functions for a good life, a satisfying life, ground up. And these functions are absolutely irreplaceable. There is no outside agency that can come in and, in a satisfying, enduring, and beautiful, joyful way, do these things better than we can. There's counterfeit versions of it. Boy, is there lots of those, but none of them will lead to something that will be joyful for us collectively and will be sustainable for our planet. So I want to speak about those 7 functions in a moment. They're interwoven and storied functions. But just to get into the spirit of that, I want to tell a story. The story is actually set in a neighborhood of Voorstad, which is in Deventer in the Netherlands. And the story centers around 2 men. 2 men sitting outside, and they're sitting on their deck chairs, and one turns to another. Patrick and Lennart are their names. And Patrick says to Lennart, this whole environment is too harsh. There are too many bricks. There's bricks everywhere. There's bricks on our houses. There's bricks on our sidewalks. There's bricks on the street. There's bricks everywhere. But there's nothing that softens the environment. There's very little flowers or, greenery or verges, nothing, just bricks. So Lennart is kind of totally in agreement with Patrick. And he says, well, why don't we do something about that? And Patrick says to Leonard, but what can we do? They both decide that what they do is they'll go into their houses and bring pickaxes and shovels out and start. This is, of course, completely illegal. I'm not giving you any advice on placemaking here. So please don't take this literally. Do not try this at home. They come out, they start digging the bricks out of their street, and they create little mini gardens. So they kind of turn the bricks up on their side and basically create little flower boxes, put some compost in and put some flowers in. Over the course of a couple of days, their neighbors are walking by, and Patrick and Lennart are sitting very proudly by their flower boxes, and they're getting lots of compliments. And they're helpful kind of guys. They want to be useful in their neighborhood. So they start offering their neighbors free labor. They say, hey, you like this? We can do one for you. And within about a week and a half, there's about 20, 30 of these popping up on the street, left and right across the street on their side as well. And over the course of a few weeks, this starts to spread like a positive virus. And people are hearing about this idea and even trying it out themselves. So Patrick and Lennart start mentoring other people on other streets and doing this. And one day, while they're mentoring somebody on a few streets, a couple of blocks away from their houses, they meet a lady who's knitting outside of her house, and they start chatting with her, and they say, hey, we know of a knit and natter group. It's a group of people who enjoy knitting, and they're trying to set a Guinness Book World Record for the longest scarf ever knit in one neighborhood. They're aiming for a 3-kilometer long scarf. The idea would be that they would wrap the scarf around every lamp post in the neighborhood and completely surround the neighborhood to the colors of their local community soccer team. It's one of the few, it's not the only, it's one of the few actual neighborhood owned soccer teams in Europe that are still left. Most of the soccer teams now have been commercialized, but this one still remains definitively owned by the local community. Barcelona is another one, but it's a bit bigger. Anybody who knows anything about soccer will know what I mean. So they're very, very proud of this football club, this soccer club called Go Ahead Eagles. And so they're knitting with those colors. So the lady who was knitting on her own joins in with this group. This is kind of like a micro story within the bigger story, because a couple of days later, they then meet a number of parents who complain that in this neighborhood, there's not a lot for smaller children to do. There's no safe spaces for them to play. What's really striking about Patrick and Lennart is their people who tend to motivate their neighbors. They're kind of get up and go people. So whenever their neighbor says, well, this is a problem or I'm lonely, they have this impulse to connect them and also to encourage them to try to be proactive in responding to the issue. So when they hear that the parents are worried that there's nothing for their kids to do, they connect them into allotments and they actually start the process of by hand building playgroups and play areas and responding in that way over the course of about 3-4 months. They've created all of these little micro initiatives that are completely led by local people, simply by connecting people like John was talking about a few moments ago, by their gifts, their interests, or even their concerns to different assets in the local community. It may be the built-in natural environment, it may be an association, it may in some cases be a local institution that creates some access or a meeting place. But in all kinds of ways, what they were doing was in effect weaving the neighborhood together. So after about 4 months of this, the Go Ahead Eagles, the football club, who have their own stadium, reach out to Patrick and Leonard and they say, how many of these associations, clubs and groups and initiatives do you think that you've either helped start up or you've encountered? And by that point, Patrick and Leonard had lost count. They just simply didn't know anymore. There were hundreds of these new connections forming, new initiatives emerging, and in all kinds of ways, almost like a wovenness, an interwovenness of all kinds of different relationships were emerging. So the Go Ahead Eagles said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we send out a message to all of the associations and all of the people that you have met over the course of the last 4 months and invite them into a community conversation? They can come, we can spend the day together, have some nice food, and have a conversation about the future. This was 2015, when the Syrian crisis was at its height. And people were fleeing the war in Syria and were coming to Europe looking for refuge. This community, the Voorstad community, was one of the communities that the Dutch government said was a community that would be a host community for families from Syria. One of the things that people mentioned that day when they all got together at the Go Ahead Eagles football stadium was that they were quite concerned by what they'd seen in other neighborhoods, where expressions of hate crime and racism was being engaged in other neighborhoods in relation to Syrian refugees who were coming into the communities, families coming in. So they wanted to do something that sent a message to those families and sent a message to the world that Voorstad, this neighborhood in Deventer in the Netherlands in Europe, was a neighborhood that had a welcome for the stranger at the edge, that it was a neighborhood that had confidence, that because it had managed to weave and connect its associations, its built environment, the gifts of individuals, the assets that John had talked about already, that it had a space and a welcome for those who were at the edge. And so what they did as an outward expression of that welcome was they knit another scarf, which they wrapped around the houses of the families that were coming to live. As an expression in the Netherlands, in Dutch, there's a word called gezellig, which means warmth or welcome or homeliness. And they wanted to send out a message that says, around here, we don't just say we're inclusive, we show it. And so I love that story because in all kinds of ways, I think in that story are the 7 functions that we talk about in the book. It's a story with many micro stories and twists and turns that give us a sense of why the canvas of the neighborhood is such a rich canvas. And I think you can see that from the story that in all kinds of ways, you can see the functions at play. So we know that 85% of what determines our health is our own agency, the extent to which we're in association with other people. If you're not a member of any club or group or association and you join one, you reduce the possibility of dying statistically in the next year by 50%. There's no pharmacological intervention that's better for your health in that sense than community. Also, in this community, because there was such a level of interconnectedness, they were increasing security. Because the two primary drivers of security at a neighborhood level are how many neighbors you know by first name and how often you're doing things in the built environment. And you could see in the story all of the different ways that communities were getting to know each other by first name, neighbors, but also doing things collectively in the neighborhood. And this wasn't just people who shared the same opinions, but these are people who often had very different opinions, but they agreed that it would be a good idea to knit a scarf or to try to create a playground or to do a mini garden. And so they found in all kinds of ways, despite at a citywide level, that they were polarized in their opinions. When they actually started doing what they cared about at the neighborhood level, they found common ground. The story is all about the ecology, about caring for the built and natural environment, even if sometimes it was in breach of the bylaws of the municipality. They were still doing things that were bringing greenery and beauty back into what was, in effect, a very harsh environment, and in softening that environment and actually shaping that environment with love themselves. They were creating an ecology which was making them feel better and also showing a responsibility for their natural environment too. So there was a natural positive feedback. The other thing that started to happen in that neighborhood through that story was the patronage of local businesses was increasing, because local businesses were also helping many of these initiatives and contributing and participating. And so what they were able to do was to ensure that a euro that before they started to connect in the way that I described in the story, maybe circulated once around the local economy and then disappeared to a box retail outlet outside of the neighborhood, that same €1 was now circulating 3, 4, 5 times around the neighborhood, because people were being really intentional about how they could make their money stay within the local economy and circulate more often. Also, people really began to think about projects like Incredible Edible. How can we grow our own food so that it's in season, it's nutritious, it's affordable? So local people in the story that I've shared with Patrick and Leonard started to begin to think very deeply about food sovereignty, but also thinking about themselves not just as consumers of food, but as co-producers and co-creators of really, really great food. Now, in this story as well, you hear such beautiful examples, I think, of inviting children not just to play in the playgrounds, but to be involved in all kinds of different ways. And we see this, we all know it takes a village to raise a child, but you've actually got to do the work to create the village within which that can happen. And what's really joyful, I think, about places like Vorstadt is that you're also seeing children growing up, and they're seeing a way. They're seeing a culture that says, around here, we welcome people. We welcome the stranger at the edge. We have a seat at the table. We believe in hospitality. And so in many ways, I think the story that I shared that started in that very, very humble conversation that Patrick and Leonard had outside their house was a story about care that effectively permeated the entire neighborhood. And in doing so, took a neighborhood that was very disconnected and brought it together to function like an organism, to function like what you might describe as a tapestry, in a sense. I'm calling in from Dublin, Ireland. We have lots of traditions that I'm personally very proud of, and I wish I knew more about. But one of the traditions I'm learning a little bit about recently is lace making, because I'm working with a number of women's groups who are trying to restore the ancient Celtic art of lace making, and initiatives like Toss the Bobbin, which I knew nothing about before about maybe 3 months ago, when I've started listening and learning, as well as understanding the relevance of each of the functions that I've just shared with you. We need to think, get our heads around, if you like, and our hearts around how we can, in a way, braid or weave these functions together, because it's in the weaving of the functions into a tapestry that we're actually most likely to create a culture a culture where everybody in the local neighborhood has a real sense that their gift is welcomed and that their contribution is absolutely essential. So in the story I shared, it started out talking about street gardens. And then it went into thinking about loneliness and then connecting with children and reaching out to Syrian refugees. As we wrote the book, The Connected Community, what became really clear to us was that the neighborhood as a primary unit of change is like a weaver's loom. It's the perfect threshold or environment within which all kinds of things can happen, where we can get those functions virtuously braiding together and weaving together. But the interesting thing, I think, is you might have the loom of the neighborhood, and we might have all of these different functions, these 7 functions. So you could just imagine that there's lots of people who individually care about caring for children, for example, and lots of others who care about perhaps the environment or health. The exciting part, I think, is when we're all in relationship and finding ways that health feeds into environment, feeds into caring for the children. So these individual functions could be thought of as the threads on the loom. And ultimately, I think the challenge that we're really trying to think about in the connected community is what can we do to weave those threads into a tapestry? So our work, I think, is the work of tapestry building, because it's the tapestry that ultimately symbolizes and represents culture, the culture of the neighborhood, which has the holding and carrying capacity for the gifts of every individual and has a welcome for all.
Thanks for listening. Check the show notes for more info about John, Cormac, and their new book, The Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth, and Power of Neighborhoods. This episode has been hosted by me, Rabbi Miriam Turlinchamp. It's been produced by the amazing Joey Taylor, and the music is from Jeff Gorman.